Okay, good afternoon. Please open up your Gemara to Daf Daled, and your note should be open up to page 35. We are going to focus now on a very important Tosfos on this sugya. This Tosfos is going to explain the discussion in the Gemara in a different way that we have learned until now. And first, we'll start with a couple of words. If you look at top of page 35, word number 1 is an abbreviation. It stands for de'im ken, that if so. The word mighty comes from the word ata. Ata means come, mighty means brings. 3, raya is a proof. And finally, number 4, dachi is to reject, to push off, like aseh doche lo ta'aseh, to reject. So Tosfos begins Ala maskir livdog de chamir de dehu. Tosfos is focusing on the reasoning that was given at the opening of the sugya. We explained that the reason why the landlord should check is because the chamira didehu, because it is his chametz. And Tosfos begins by stating that there is a way to understand this word that is incorrect. And he'll explain to us why it is incorrect. First, how could you explain these words? Like the way that Rashi seems to have understood them. Ein lefarish. This word should not be explained as atam, as the reason given, the kevan de shelohu, that since the chametz is his, since the landlord owns the chametz, vein adam yachol levatel, and no one else can nullify, no one else can disown the chametz, elahu chayav livdok, and therefore he is chayav. This cannot be the reason that the Gemara is giving to justify why the landlord has to do bedika. It's not because he owns the chametz and no one else can disown it, which is the way Rashi seems to be learning. Tosfos does not accept that reasoning, even though literally that's what the words mean. The chamira didehu, it's his chametz. It sounds like the Gemara is emphasizing the fact that he owns the chametz. Tosfos says it's not the ownership of the chametz that is the problem. And the reason why that cannot be the explanation, the imken, that is so, amai nakat maskir lechaveru beyudalit. Tosfos asks, why would the Gemara take it? Why would the Gemara bring out this case that he's renting it on the 14th? Afilu beyud gimel, even if the rental happened on the 13th of Nisan, is chayev amaskir mehai taima livdok. The maskir would be chayev to check for the very same reason that he owns the chametz. So the date would be irrelevant. If it's really about the ownership of the chametz, then the date of the rental doesn't seem to play a role in the case. And since the Gemara explained that the case is somebody rented on the 14th, then apparently the date does very much matter. So again, if the issue, the reason to justify, to obligate the landlord to check is the fact that he owns the chametz, then why is the rental happen on the 14th, even if it happened a week before Pesach? We would have the same question the night before Pesach. Why? Because the landlord owns the chametz, it's his chametz, and the tenant has the domain. So who cares when it was rented? If it's a question of ownership of chametz versus the control of the domain, this issue is going to come up regardless of when the rental happens. Once explaining why this cannot be the reason given to justify obligating the landlord, lekach mefarish ri, therefore the ri, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, which was one of the founders of the Tosfos school, gives a different reason. The chamira didehu, that when the Gemara says it is the landlord's chametz, what the Gemara means to say is not just that it's his chametz. It means v'chal alav chiyuv bedika, the obligation initially falls on him, sha'achas kodem she'iskira, a moment before he rented it out. So it's not just about the fact that he owns the chametz. It's that since it is his chametz, the obligation first falls on him. I own the chametz, so first the obligation comes on the landlord. It is his obligation. And what's the question then? Which Tosfos doesn't express it, but it's understood. Then what's the question? The question is that now that there is a tenant involved in the case, does the obligation transfer along with the house to the tenant? Initially, it was the landlord's. There's no question that it was the landlord's initial obligation. That's what Chamira Didehu means, that he owns the chametz, and therefore there's a consequence. The consequence is that the obligation of Bedika falls on him. The question now is, can that obligation transfer along to the tenant who is now occupying the premises? And then Tosfos says beautifully, Umaisi raya mi mezuzah. And this is what the Gemara is bringing a proof from mezuzah. What's the proof? The afal pi the chal chiyuv kodem sheizkir, that even though the obligation falls on the landlord before he rents it out, ala socher lasos mezuzah, then we see that the tenant has to the mezuzah, which illustrates that the obligation can be transferred. So the same thing should be true of Bedika, that initially was the obligation of the landlord, but once he rents it out, the obligation is transferable to the tenant, just like in the case of mezuzah. So Tosfos is interpreting the proof of mezuzah different than Rashi was explaining. Rashi understood mezuzah to be an illustration of two factors, and one overpowers the other one. It's an issue of domain versus ownership, which is parallel to the case of chametz. And according to Tosfos, the parallel between the case of mezuzah and bedika is that initially the obligation falls on one individual, namely the landlord, but once the tenant moves in, the obligation is transferred to the tenant. Vedachi, and the Gemara rejects the proof, the mezuzah chov asadarhi, the mezuzah is only the obligation of the tenant. Kelomar, meaning, afilu lo aya maskira, even if the landlord would not rent out the place, ayayacho liftor me mezuzah, he will be exempt from the mitzvah of mezuzah. Shelo aya dar umishtamish babais, that he would not be residing in the house or using in any way, and therefore he will be patur, meaning mezuzah does not illustrate transference, because mezuzah is not a case that shows an obligation falls on the landlord and then goes on the tenant. No, the obligation of mezuzah was never the landlord's to begin with, because if he doesn't use the house, he doesn't occupy the premises, the obligation never falls on the landlord. It's only the obligation only begins with the tenant who is a resident, chovas adar. But the case of chametz is not parallel to mezuzah. Because in the case of chametz, if there will be no tenant, it's tarek livdok. Then the landlord would have to go into the house and check, even though he doesn't live there. So mezuzah is rejected because it does not demonstrate transference of an obligation, and therefore the Gemara was not able to use the mezuzah to resolve the issue of who has to check. But again, according to Tosfos, the issue of chametz is different than according to Rashi. According to Rashi, the issue was what's stronger, ownership of the chametz or control of the domain. And according to Tosfos, the shaila, the issue was, does an obligation that falls on one person transfer to another person, namely from the landlord to the tenant? And as the Gemara explains, that maybe mezuzah is a proof that the obligation goes on to the tenant. And Tosfos explains the reason why mezuzah doesn't work is different than Rashi, because according to Tosfos, what mezuzah fails to demonstrate is transference of an obligation. The obligation never was the landlord's to begin with, because in mezuzah we know that in order to be obligated there has to be a sense of residence, there has to be occupancy, and therefore the landlord never had the obligation to begin with. And therefore we cannot use the case of mezuzah to resolve the doubt of chametz. If you please look in your notes on page 35, we will start with question number 1. The reason that the masker might be the one who must do bedika is not because he owns the chametz and no one else can do bitul. The reason that this cannot be the reason according to Tosfos is because if it's the ownership of the chametz that might obligate him to check, then this question would arise even if the rental happened on the 13th or days before Pesach. When the day before Pesach comes, we would have the same question. He owns the chametz, so perhaps he should check. And since the Gemara is focusing on the 14th, there must be something unique about the 14th. And therefore, Tosfos says when the Gemara mentioned he owns the chametz, it doesn't mean that he owns the chametz. It means something different. The correct reason, further in your notes, that the masker might have to do the bedika, according to Tosfos, is because initially it is his obligation because the chametz is his. But again, it's about the obligation being first his, not just because he owns the chametz. Number two, Tosfos does not say why the socher might have to do the bedika, but the reason is apparent. The reason is because although clearly it's initially the obligation of the landlord, the question is, can that obligation be transferred to the tenant once he moves in? Does he assume that responsibility? Number three, according to Tosfos, how did the Gemara attempt to answer the sheila by using the case of mezuzah? Because mezuzah seems to show that the obligation of mezuzah went from the landlord to the tenant. That's what it seems to show. And therefore, if the obligation is transferable, well, the same thing by bedika. Number four, why was this attempted answer rejected? Because in the case of mezuzah, the chiyuv was always on the tenant, on the one who resides, because mezuzah depends on residence. While in the case of bedika, the chiyuv could be on the landlord, because he owns the chametz and the obligation is his first, but the chiyuv could also be on the tenant, because he's the one who's there now, and he's the one who might eat it, he's the one who has the responsibility. Next page, we look at the steps, so we compare and contrast with Rashi, the chart on the top of the page. So the lashon of the Gemara is alamasker livdo de chamira didehu. Literally what that means is, the way Rashi takes it, that the masker should check because he owns the chametz. According to Tosfos, what that means is that since he owns the chametz, he takes it a step further. Since he owns the chametz, it is his obligation. It's initially his obligation to begin with. The next step is ala socher livdok de isura b'rishus ekai. Again, Rashi takes that literally, that he is now in control of the domain. The tenant is in control of the domain. What Tosfos would explain is that since the socher now is in the house, perhaps the obligation transfers to him. According to Tosfos, the whole issue is one of transference. The next step is the proof. The sugya brings the proof of the fact that the tenant does the mezuzah. So according to Rashi, the proof was that shows that domain is stronger than ownership. And according to Tosfos, what mezuzah shows is that an obligation is transferable to the tenant. And then finally, the Gemara rejects the case of mezuzah as a proof by saying mezuzah chovas adarhi. So according to Rashi, what that means is that in mezuzah there's only domain, ownership is irrelevant, and therefore it doesn't show that domain is stronger than ownership. And according to Tosfos, what the case of mezuzah fails to do is mezuzah is not a case that shows transference because the owner never had the obligation to begin with. And we'll stop here.